I still remember every detail of that night. The gentle sound of violins, the golden lights dancing across the hall, and the weight of something in the air I couldn't quite explain. It was a masquerade ball, but it felt like more than that, as if everyone there was hiding more than just their faces. At the time, I thought it was just my imagination. Now, I know it wasn't. I was leaning against one of the columns, watching couples spinning across the dance floor, their elegant outfits reflecting the light from the chandeliers. I'd never been fond of parties, but something about that night had drawn me there, though I couldn't say exactly what. My black dress fit me perfectly, and the golden mask I'd chosen hid much of my face, but not enough to conceal my restless eyes. As I tried to distract myself, I felt a presence. I didn't see him right away, but I knew. It was as if someone was watching me from across the room. My heart raced for no apparent reason, yet I remained still, pretending nothing was happening. It wasn't until I glanced around that I saw him for the first time. He wore a silver mask that reflected the lights, yet his dark eyes were unmistakable. There was something in them, something that made me feel as though he knew me, even though I was sure I'd never seen him before. He said nothing, just stood there, watching me from afar. It should have been unsettling, but it wasn't. On the contrary, I felt mesmerized. I looked away, trying to ignore the feeling growing inside me. I took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down. It's just the atmosphere of the party, I thought. But when I looked back, he was gone. My eyes scanned the room, but he had vanished, as though he'd never been there. Before I could question my own sanity, I heard a voice. "Aren't you going to dance?" I turned around, and there he was, closer than I'd expected. My breath caught for a moment. He was tall, dressed in an impeccable suit that seemed tailor-made for him. The silver mask concealed much of his face, but his eyes, they shone with something I couldn't decipher. He extended his hand, and for a moment, I froze. "I'm not good at dancing with strangers," I replied, trying to sound confident, but my voice came out soft, almost a whisper. "Then don't be a stranger." His smile was small, but loaded with meaning. I should have declined. I should have come up with an excuse and left. But something in me, something I couldn't explain, made me accept. When I placed my hand in his, I felt a warmth that traveled up my arm and made me catch my breath. He led me to the center of the room, and suddenly, it was as if the world around us had disappeared. When he placed one hand on my waist and held my hand firmly with the other, a shiver ran through me. His touch was warm, steady, and yet dangerous. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to distract myself from what I was feeling. "Maybe I'll tell you before the night is over," he replied cryptically. The music began, and we moved as though we'd danced together our entire lives. I couldn't explain it, but every step felt synchronized, every touch intentional. His hand on my waist climbed slightly, tracing a path that made me acutely aware of every curve of my own body. My heart beat so fast I was sure he could hear it. He tilted his head, bringing his lips closer to my ear. The proximity was suffocating, yet I couldn't pull away. "You seem nervous, Dominique." My name on his lips was like a spark, a jolt that coursed through my entire body. "I'm not nervous," I lied, though I knew he could feel otherwise. "No?" He chuckled softly, and the sound was like muffled thunder in my chest. "Because I can feel otherwise." I wanted to ask how he knew my name, but before I could say anything, he spun me. My feet barely touched the ground, and when he pulled me back, we were closer than before. He tilted his face again, his gaze locked on mine, and for a moment, the entire ballroom vanished. "Do you know me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away. He just smiled, that enigmatic smile that said everything and nothing at the same time. Before I could press him, he dipped me backward, holding me firmly. His face was so close, I could feel his breath on my skin. "Perhaps more than you realize," he finally said. his voice low and laden with something I couldn't decipher. And then, as if the universe around us had paused, the music stopped. He pulled me back upright, his eyes still locked on mine, and before I could say anything, he stepped away slightly. The emptiness his absence left was immediate, almost physical. I should have felt relieved, but all I could feel was his absence. Something had changed in me that night, something I didn't yet understand. All I knew was that this man, with his silver mask and hypnotic touch, had left a mark on me. And I knew this was only the beginning. When he guided me out of the ballroom, my body seemed to act on its own. I should have hesitated, questioned him, but instead, I let him lead me. The music in the distance still echoed, but it no longer mattered. All I could hear was the sound of our breathing and the soft click of our steps against the floor. We arrived at a balcony lit only by the moonlight. The cool air brushed against my skin, but it wasn't enough to calm the heat burning inside me. I was nervous, but not the kind of nervousness that brings fear. It was something visceral, a sweet and unbearable tension. "The night is beautiful, don't you think?" he asked, stopping beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It's different," I replied, my voice quieter than I'd expected. He laughed softly, and the sound reverberated inside me, as intense as the touch of his fingers. He stepped closer, and I felt his presence like a wave enveloping me. His hand touched my shoulder, slowly moving upward to push aside a strand of hair that had fallen over my neck. The simple gesture made me hold my breath. "Different how?" he asked, his lips so close to my ear that each word seemed to brush against my skin. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was chaos, torn between questions and sensations. All I knew was that his touch made my skin tingle, as though he was rekindling something within me that I didn't even know was there. He leaned in, his lips lightly grazing the curve of my neck. It was such a subtle touch that it could have been accidental, but it wasn't. Heat rose from my stomach, spreading through the rest of my body like wildfire. "Who are you?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, he smiled, that enigmatic smile that made my mind spin. "Someone who knows you better than you think," he replied, his tone deep and heavy with meaning. My legs weakened, and I leaned against the balcony railing. He moved closer, closing the space between us until the cold stone at my back contrasted with the heat radiating from him. His hand slid along the side of my body, his touch light but deliberate. Every movement seemed calculated, as if he knew exactly how to leave me breathless. "I should go," I tried to say, but my voice faltered halfway through the sentence. "Should you?" He tilted his head, his lips dangerously close to mine. "Then why haven't you?" I had no answer, because deep down, I didn't want to leave. My heart was racing, my breathing uneven, and every part of me seemed to be giving in to the moment. He knew it. Before I could come up with an excuse, he lifted my hand and pressed it against his chest. I could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat, strong, steady, as if he were entirely in control, while I was on the verge of falling apart. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice so low it felt like a secret. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was look at him, my gaze locked onto the eyes that seemed to strip me bare, exposing me in a way no one ever had. He moved even closer, until our bodies were completely aligned. His lips brushed against mine, and it felt like the entire world disappeared. It was such a gentle, careful touch, but it carried an intensity that took my breath away. I felt my fingers clutching at the fabric of his shirt, desperately holding onto something, anything, while everything inside me crumbled. When he finally kissed me, there was nothing gentle about it. It was as though every barrier that had existed between us was suddenly torn down. He pulled me even closer, his hands sliding down to my waist, holding me with a firmness that made it clear he wasn't letting go. The sensation was overwhelming. Every movement of his lips against mine, every touch, felt like it was setting my skin on fire. My mind was blank, incapable of forming a single coherent thought. All I knew was that I had never felt anything like this before. So intense, so urgent, so impossible to ignore. He pressed me against the railing of the balcony, and I felt the cold stone against my back as his warmth surrounded me. His hands traveled upward, sliding along the sides of my body, tracing every curve as if he wanted to memorize every detail. "You're unbelievable," he murmured against my lips, his voice rough and heavy with emotion. I wanted to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I let my hands explore the contours of his shoulders, his neck, every part I could reach. I was completely lost in him, and he knew it. The kiss deepened, growing more desperate, as if we were both trying to grasp something we didn't want to lose. The tension between us was almost unbearable, and I knew, in that moment, there was no turning back. Something inside me had been awakened, something that couldn't be ignored. And as he held me there, as if I were everything he needed, I realized that, somehow, I felt the same way too. The world around me disappeared. There were no more lights, no music, nothing but him and me. The balcony, once so vast, now felt too small to contain the heat that surrounded us. Every inch of my body was on fire, and deep down, I knew there was no turning back. His lips found mine again, but this time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss full of hunger, of urgency, as if he was trying to consume me entirely. My hands gripped his shoulders tighter, as though he were the only thing keeping me upright. When his lips moved to my neck, it felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Each kiss was hot, damp, leaving trails that burned on my skin. Instinctively, I leaned back, offering more of my neck, more of myself, without even thinking. "Dominique," he murmured against my skin, the sound of my name in his raspy voice, sending shivers from my head to my toes. His hand, which had rested on my waist, began to slide downward. His fingers traced the curve of my hip slowly, exploring every inch with a precision that felt almost cruel. My breathing quickened, my chest rising and falling so rapidly it felt like I might explode. "You know this is inevitable, don't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as his fingers toyed with the hem of my dress. I knew. There was no need for words. My body had already answered for me. I wanted him more than I had ever wanted anything in my life, and he knew it. When he lifted the hem of my dress, his hands finally touched my bare skin. A shiver ran down my spine, making my knees weak. He pressed his body against mine, the contrast between his heat and the cold marble behind me almost unbearable. Every touch, every movement seemed calculated to leave me on the edge of collapse. "Look at me," he demanded. And even though my mind was in chaos, I obeyed. Our eyes met, and what I saw completely disarmed me. There was intensity, yes, but also something deeper, something I couldn't quite identify, but that left me feeling utterly exposed. He took hold of my leg, lifting it to wrap around his waist, and in that moment, our bodies aligned in a way that felt right, as if they were made for this. I felt my heart race, heat rising to my face, while my hands traveled up his arms, exploring the tense muscles beneath the fabric of his shirt. Every movement he made was deliberate, full of a confidence that left me completely out of control. When he pressed his hips against mine, a moan escaped my lips before I could stop it. He smiled, that satisfied smile that told me he knew exactly what he was doing to me. "You're unbelievable," he said, his voice so low it felt like it was meant just for me. He slid his hands upward, cupping my face with a firm yet gentle touch that made me want to cry. He kissed me again, and in that moment, everything I was, everything I felt, seemed to condense into that single act. It was overwhelming, but at the same time it felt like exactly what I needed. His hands resumed their exploration of my body, tracing lines that felt like they were setting my skin on fire. When his lips returned to my neck, my head fell back, unable to withstand the intensity of the moment. He was like a storm, surrounding me, consuming me, and I wanted nothing more than to lose myself completely in him. I felt the last barriers within me dissolve, and for the first time in so long, I allowed myself to be completely vulnerable. There were no more doubts, no more fears, only pure, uncontrollable desire. He paused for a moment, looking at me as if trying to capture the moment forever. His eyes were darker now, filled with something I couldn't name but that I recognized within myself. "I've waited so long for this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he kissed me again. It was as if that kiss was an answer, an explanation words could never provide. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling gently as our bodies moved together. Every touch, every movement brought a new wave of heat, a new intensity I didn't know I could feel. He lifted me, and I felt the world completely fade away. There was no balcony, no party, no one else, just the two of us, surrendering to something that felt bigger than anything. My body was on fire, and in that moment, I knew I would never be the same again. When I opened my eyes, I felt the cold night air against my skin. The heat of his presence, which just moments ago had seemed like it would never fade, was now only a memory, yet it still burned within me. The balcony was empty. Only the sound of the distant fountain broke the silence as the moonlight cast a silver glow all around. He was gone. I looked around, confused, trying to make sense of what had happened. My fingers instinctively touched my lips, as though searching for proof that the moment had been real. But he was no longer there, and his absence felt like an almost physical weight. And then I saw it. His silver mask lay there, resting on the stone railing of the balcony. My heart raced at the sight of it. I picked it up carefully, feeling the cold material against my hands. It was real. He was real. The moment, the touch, the heat, it had all been real. Beside the mask, there was a note. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, and the words, written in elegant handwriting, seemed to explode in my mind. "Dominique, this dance was only the beginning. When the time is right, you'll know where to find me. Until then, remember, destiny always brings us together." I read those words over and over, trying to make sense of them. How did he know my name? Who was he? And why did it feel like he knew me so well, when I knew nothing about him? I returned to the ballroom, hoping to find him again, but everything was just as it had been before. People danced and laughed, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. To them, it was just another night. To me, it was the beginning of something I couldn't understand, but already knew I wouldn't be able to ignore. I tried to go back to my routine, but every detail of my life seemed to carry traces of him. The wind brushing against my window at night, the sound of distant music, even the way light reflected off shiny surfaces, everything reminded me of that night. I placed the mask and the note in a drawer beside my bed. I thought hiding them would help me move on, but the truth was, I couldn't stay away from them. Every night, before I slept, I held them, running my fingers over the cold material of the mask, searching for answers that never came. And then, one night, I noticed something I had missed before. Inside the mask, there was a small symbol engraved, barely visible. It looked like an old seal, something familiar, yet I couldn't place it immediately. I stared at the symbol, trying to remember. It felt like a memory was trapped inside me, struggling to surface. I closed my eyes, and flashes began to appear. A different ballroom, ancient tapestries covering the walls, music that seemed to belong to another time. And he was there. Not exactly as he had been that night, but still, him. His eyes met mine from across the room, filled with intensity, as though he knew exactly who I was. And then, I heard his voice. "I promised we'd meet again, Dominique. We always meet again." I shot upright in bed, gasping for breath. My body was drenched in sweat, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. It was a dream, but it felt as real as the night on the balcony. The next morning, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the mask and the note in my hands. Something inside me told me I couldn't ignore this any longer. I needed answers. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew he had left a path for me to follow. I packed a small suitcase, carefully placing the mask and the note inside. Every movement felt heavy, laden with meaning. When I closed the suitcase, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt as though he knew I would do this. As I stepped out of my house, the morning wind felt different, charged with energy. The city was slowly waking up, but to me, it felt like the beginning of something far greater. I hailed a cab, clutching the note in my pocket. Every word written on it was etched into my mind, echoing over and over. Destiny always brings us together. I gazed out the window as the cab wound through the still, quiet streets. The scenery blurred past me, but my thoughts remained fixed on him, on the way he had touched me, the heat of his breath, the intensity of his gaze. "Who are you?" I whispered to myself. Deep down, I knew I was about to find out. The road ahead of me seemed endless, but I wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be, doing what I was meant to do. The note in my pocket was a promise, and the mask in my suitcase was the key. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew my life would never be the same, and I was ready for whatever came next.